Lesson 9 will be our risk response planning. So we have planned risk management, we have identified our risks, performed qualitative risk analysis, performed quantitative risk analysis. Now it's time to determine what responses that we want to take to the various risks. Now this is one of those lessons that are really critical from an exam perspective because there's going to be a lot of definitions in here, and those definitions may or may not fully align with what you've experienced in your career or on your projects or within your organization. So definitely a lot of key things in here, key information from a definition and vocab perspective. So we'll talk about risk response planning as a process, the critical success factors, response planning process and the steps we're going to go through, the various risk responses, and there's going to be a whole suite of those for you to learn, the tools and techniques, and then the results. All right, so risk response planning is going to determine which set of actions most enhance the chances of project success while complying with our applicable organizational and project constraints. There are going to be some risks it would be too expensive to do something about, or potentially we just can't. So again, this will determine the most appropriate set of actions or responses. So we'll identify the response strategy, and this is also the process where we will identify an owner, a risk owner. That's an important phrase, and there's, from a practical perspective, it's key to remember as well. Again, as project manager, you can't do everything. And so I talked about project management being about delegation. Assigning someone as an owner, whether it's a work package owner or in this case, a risk owner. That word owner tends to psychologically engage somebody a little bit more in the task at hand. So I want to make sure my risk owners know who they are, and I always refer to them as risk owners. They will be the ones that are on the lookout for any changes within the risk environment or within the qualities of the risk itself. Finding ways, when we plan our responses, to make any threats smaller or eliminate it entirely, and perhaps make positive risks more likely or greater in impact. So this is where it all comes together and we decide what we're going to do with the particular risk. Okay, so we want to make sure from a risk response perspective that it's appropriate to the level and priority of the risk, while also being cost effective and realistic within the context of the project. Again, I've been in situations where people have wanted to spend more money on a risk response than the actual risk event itself would cost if it occurred. And so you just want to balance that and make sure it's appropriate. We always want to review our risk responses throughout the life of the project for appropriateness. As things change in our environment, as things change on the project, certain responses may not be appropriate anymore or may have changed. So we want to continually evaluate. Okay? Different risk responses may include doing something to eliminate the threats before they happen, which is called risk avoidance. We'll talk in more detail about that. We may do something to ensure the opportunity is realized, which we call opportunity exploitation, exploiting the opportunity. We'll talk about that in a moment. Decreasing the probability and or impact of threats, that's called mitigation. Mitigate the risk, or increase the probability and or impact of opportunities. That's called enhancing the opportunity. So all these terms we're going to go through here in a few moments. Can have potential effects on the project objectives and can also generate additional risks. We call them secondary risks. So for example, we buy an insurance policy, right, which is considered risk transference. Well, that's going to hit my cost budget and potentially cause a secondary risk where I can't afford to do another piece of work. And so we always want to evaluate our responses to see if they're generating secondary risks. Once your risk responses are approved, we want to make sure we've integrated them into the project management plan. Okay, so we've integrated whatever those responses are into our project management plan because we know that those responses may affect change management, resource management, communication, and it's going to affect our constraints of our project: cost, scope, schedule, quality. We're adding something to the work of our project, and so it's going to have an impact. We want to make sure that that project management plan is updated, and you're going to see that as one of our outputs from this particular process. For risks that are remaining, meaning residual risks, which we're not going to do anything about, or that remaining after actions have been taken. We may do what's called a contingency plan or contingent response strategy. I mentioned that in relation to those yellow risks, right? That's planned in advance but only invoked if the actual risk event occurs. Or we may do something if those plans are not effective or our primary strategy is not effective, which is called implementing a fallback plan, a plan B, a fallback plan. Also planned in advance, but only intended for use if the original response is not effective. All right, critical success factors for planning our risk responses. We want to have open communication to address organizational causes of risk, because again, there may be some things we can or we can't do something with, especially if there is some political or organizational sensitivity. So we want to have that open dialogue. You want to make sure you have risk-related roles and responsibilities defined, communicated, and agreed upon. Big emphasis on that. Again, that's that delegation piece, and you want to make sure people are very clear what their responsibilities are going to be as it relates to these risk responses. Availability and allocation of resources for these risk responses, and that can include human resources, the people to actually carry out the response, the budget, and the time. That all needs to be factored in on these approved responses. We want to have an understanding of the implications between the risks and the risk responses. What are the interactions going to be? What are the implications? Will there be secondary risks? Will there be residual risks? We want to make sure that both threats and opportunities are addressed. And again, slight change of normal thinking. Typically we focus on threats. Remember, on this exam, they'll also be looking at you to take responses on opportunities potentially. And then this last point is really critical. I'm going to explain it a little bit. Responses are to be planned strategically and then validated tactically and integrated into our plan. So what that means is we want to figure out strategically, okay, what's our approach to this risk? What is our response to this particular risk? What makes sense for us to get to a point where we're comfortable? But then we need to say, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. How are we going to do it? And that's that tactical piece, that validating it tactically. I'll give a kind of a silly example, high-level example. Let's say fire alarms, right? If you work in an office building, well, strategically, we need to get people out of the building quickly and safely, all right? Tactically, well, they can't go down the elevator, they need to go down their stairwell. And if stairwell A is broken, then they need to go to stairwell B. Okay, that's validating it tactically. How wide does the stairwell need to be? How many people can it accommodate at a time? You know, what do we do if the stairwells are blocked? Where would they go to? Okay, so it's not only strategically, how are we going to respond, but tactically, how specifically will that happen? Okay, so it gets validated tactically, and then those steps integrated into the project management plan as appropriate. Right, so let's look through this process, what we do. We want to identify potential responses, and notice that that's plural. So I have a risk identified. I want to identify different responses. I'm not just going to jump to the first one. I'm going to say, okay, what are all of our different potential responses here? And then I select the most appropriate response from those that I've evaluated. Okay, because again, there's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. Tactically plan the actions and provide the resources. Okay, how are we going to do this step by step? We want to plan that tactically. We want to make sure we've got the resources to do it. We then update our risk register with that information on our response. And then we want to say, okay, is there any risk remaining? Residual risk, think of residue. After we take this response, is there risk remaining? Is it acceptable or not? If it's not acceptable, we repeat the process. What other action should we take? What other response should we take? And you go through it again. If it's acceptable, then we update the project management plan and any associated documents. Okay, so you may be taking multiple responses on one risk, okay, or you may take one response on for multiple risks. Okay, but you want to always evaluate, make sure you get to a point where residual risk is acceptable. Okay, so risk responses, whether responding to threats or opportunities, we want to make sure that they're timely. something that we can invoke in enough time to actually manage that risk appropriate. The effort selected must be appropriate for the severity of the risk. Again, we don't want to spend more money preventing the risk than the impact would have cost if it occurred. So you want to evaluate that. Again, keep in mind, as I just mentioned, one response may be used to address more than one risk. And that's why we like to get to root cause. More than one response can be used to address the same risk. Again, you may have to do multiple responses. A response can address a root cause and thereby address more than one risk. Again, be efficient in how you're doing things. So if you can get to root cause and implement a response that treats that and thus eliminates or minimizes multiple risks, definitely take that option. You want to make sure you've involved your team, your stakeholders, and experts in selecting a strategy. Again, PMI will most likely question you on that. You don't get to sit there and pick, okay, here's how we're going to do it. You involve your team for a couple of reasons. One, they need to be aware of what the response is. They may be involved in executing that response. It's going to increase their buy-in of how it's happening. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you can't do everything on your own.